Hello there, and welcome back to the Codex. As you can see, we're hopping right into things here with Trinity, but first of all, I want to say I'm sorry for not having this video out before New Year's like I originally had planned. I've been fairly sick for the last week or so, so everything was effectively on pause, unfortunately, but we are back now with a video covering both the Trinity and the Nyx reworks, and we're starting it off with Trinity here. So let me pop my blessing and link here. The first thing you'll of course notice is, well, actually the very first thing is me killing this acolyte here. Goodbye. Anyway, the first thing you'll notice is that Blessing and Link have way better base durations now because they have, thankfully, increased the base duration of Blessing from 10 to 15 seconds. So that was a straight up 50% increase. Since that was a, again, base duration increase, so that also affects the scaling with the duration mods they put on, and they increased the Link's duration rather from 12 to 20 seconds. Now I do wish that they had also made Blessing 20 seconds so that they were both 20 seconds. That way, given the fact that you typically keep them both going simultaneously 24/7, they would just be more in sync with each other rather than being kind of offset with each other. But that's okay, it doesn't really matter. Either way, it was still a huge quality of life increase for Trinity. They also changed her first ability, which I'm not currently running because I'm instead running Roar, but Well of Life is also much better now. They've made it so that you can cast 3 Well of Lives instead of 1, so you can have 3 enemies affected by it. Those enemies affected by it also give you a larger Well of Life radius. I believe it's 20 meters instead of 15 now. One of the really interesting changes is that they buffed it to where now if an ally, including yourself, dies within a radius of one of your Well of Lives, the well will end immediately, but it will keep you from dying. So you die, and it basically triggers Well of Life, and it fully heals you instead at the cost of losing the Well of Life. So it's a very interesting interaction they added there, but a little bit of support if you want to play it that way. Energy Vampire, they also made it so that it actually scales positively with duration, because previously a lot of the time people would run negative duration Energy Vampire Trinities because no matter what, it always gave out 4 pulses of energy regardless of the duration. So if you made the duration super low, for example, like 13% with Fleeting Expertise and Transient Fortitude, then you would get all 4 pulses instantaneously. But now they made it so that you get more pulses based on duration, and given the fact that the way that Energy Vampire has always worked is that you can just kill the enemy that's EV'd and they will release the rest of the pulses. You never really had to have a short EV. You could just kill the enemy and then you would get all the energy. And especially now that the amount of energy you get scales with duration, if you have a positive duration Trinity, you get a fuckload of duration out of, or not duration, a fuckload of energy out of the enemies. So especially if you have anybody who's running like an arcane battery in your squad, for example, you could like entirely fill them up even if they have a crazy like 1k energy pool, because you get so much out of enemies. Now overall she feels much better to use. She's much more streamlined. Honestly, if the only thing they had done was increase the duration of her 3 and her 4, it would have been a very positive change for me, because the most annoying thing about playing Trinity was not that her abilities were bad, but it's that they were short. Like, it's funny because the thing I care about most in this rework is not even an actual rework. It was just making the 3 and the 4 longer. The things that were actually reworked were the 1 and the 2, but that is, to me, less impactful than not having to maintain the abilities as much, so that's fantastic. They did change her passive ability to now give allies in infinity range gain 50% of Trinity's max energy as health. So with a normal prime flow setup that you see here, you'll be giving your teammates 320 health, basically, while they're near you. So depending on what frame they're playing as, they may or may not appreciate that, depending on, how health tanky they are. Speaking of health tanking, you can see that that is entirely what I am doing here. I haven't showed you the build yet. I'm going to show you that at the end of the video this time. First, we're going to show some gameplay of both Trinity and Nyx, but if you can't tell, I'm using a Arcane Blessing setup. That's why I have 1890 health right now. And it's highly effective when you combine that with the massive amount of damage reduction that Trinity has between Link giving you 75%, Blessing giving you 75%, whatever armor you might stack on her, a little hint there about the Archon shards maybe, and especially obviously if you're running Adaptation. So very effective. And on an unrelated note, secondary innervate on the new core is absolutely insane. I don't know if you've been noticing my gameplay here of just absolutely shredding guys with a new core, but it is wild how good the new core is with this new arcane from the Hex area. I plan on doing another video covering that in the future, covering all those arcanes. So, yeah, that's about all I have to say for Trinity. I find her to be much better now, much more streamlined, much less annoying. What is this? Are you okay, bro? Oh man, he's taking a break, huh? Oh, you tell? Okay, what's going on here? Ground finisher. I don't know what's going on with this acolyte, guys. Apparently he's depressed. He's having a bad day, but let's finish him off here. Okay, goodbye. Anyway. Yeah, that's about all I have to say for Trinity. She's way better now. Like I said, I'll show you the build at the end of the video here. But now let's hop over to Nyx and talk about the changes that they have done for her. Because she is the frame that really got reworked and is basically a brand new Warframe now. Alright, so here we are with Nyx now. And as you can see, I have some Overguard on me. That is from her reworked second ability, which is maybe the best part. Actually, probably definitely the best part of the rework, to be honest. What it does is now pacifying bolts, or what's it called? That's the name of the augment, isn't it? Psychic bolts, rather, lets you steal Overguard, armor, and shields. And the max amount that you're allowed to get of any of that is based upon power strength, of course. So the more strength you have, the more you can steal. Like in this example, I can get up to 26,000 Overguard if I continue to steal enough. So basically, every single ability she has here is reworked. Now, I did go the boring choice of replacing Chaos with Nourish, and we'll talk about that more once we get to the showing the build portion of this video. But regardless, the first ability, Mind Control, is made much better. The person is more aggressive. They apply radiation damage and status. Or actually, I don't know if they... I think it's actually just status. I don't know that they actually do radiation damage. They apply radiation status to enemies that they hit. They're much more aggressive, and their damage scaling is better. As you can see, I have a Jade Light Eximus under my control. And a funny note about that is that if you take over an Eximus, the Eximus aura is on your side. This includes Jade Eximus, so he's not doing it right now, but Jade Eximus, if you can, there it is, they will call down the Jade Light on enemies, which is very funny to me, because depending on how much of a damage bonus he pumped into them, it's actually wildly effective at killing enemies. And just very fun to watch. And it seems that they're able to call down multiple Jade Lights, not just one. I don't know that a Jade Light Eximus can usually do that to players, but when she's under Nyx's, when they're under Nyx's control, they're able to call down like 2 or 3 of them. So that's pretty sweet. And the second ability, which is, as I said, the Psychic Bolts, that now strips Overguard, shields, and armor, and it gives it to you, which can make you wildly tankier. In fact, it can make you so much tankier that I finally feel like you can play Nyx without being forced to use the Assimilate augment and just stay in her fourth ability Absorb the entire fucking time. Because that's pretty much how you used to have to play Nyx if you wanted to not die instantaneously on the Steel Path. The third ability, which is usually Chaos, I've replaced it, but it's usually Chaos, was made much better in the sense that it now, instead of just applying an artificial confusion effect, it actually directly applies the instant max 10 stack of radiation status. So it actually applies real radiation stats to enemies, which of course applies the confusion effect. And speaking of the confusion effect, her new passive ability, is that she gains 40% extra crit chance to her primary and secondary for each confused enemy within her affinity range, up to 200%. So basically, you just have a permanent 200% crit chance bonus to your primary and your secondary. So especially if you're using a primary or secondary that has really high crit chance in the first place, you can get great benefit out of that. Here's an Acolyte here being very annoying. Let's try out the Absorb on them and see what happens. Doesn't really do a whole lot of damage, but that's okay. We'll just finish them off the regular way here. Again, using the Innervate new core because it's just so damn good. Now, the fourth ability, Absorb, that I just used, let's see, I went down there. Whoopsie. It's okay, it's easy to get back up. Yeah, you'll still go down occasionally if you're not keeping your bolts going. Another thing about the bolts is that every time that you kill an enemy that's affected by Psychic Bolts, it spreads 2 more bolts to nearby enemies. So if you keep killing guys that are somewhat close enough to each other, you can just keep spreading what is effectively a single cast of psychic bolts continuously. And those bolts that spread from enemies, they are full psychic bolts, so they give you the whole defense strip and adding it to your own and whatnot. So it's quite good. Now the fourth ability, Absorb, also made a lot better. It doesn't have just a enormous energy drain anymore. It instead has, I think it's just per second, isn't it? Let me take a look here. No, it's just duration based, that's right. So it just has, instead of being a per second massive drain and losing like a kajillion energy for every 1,000 damage you take, it just has a static cost. And when it ends, you gain a damage bonus based on the amount of damage that you absorbed and the amount of damage that all confused enemies around you are dealing. So the more enemies that you have rad procced around you, including your mind control target, which counts as confused, by the way, for the purposes of her passive effect, along with absorb, will add to that. So it's really easy to get a damage bonus added to yourself. So it's basically free weapon damage every time they use absorb. So it's really good. She's basically a brand new Warframe now, especially with her psychic bolts change. Fantastic. She's a frame that I actually feel like using now, because previously I didn't like the fact that you were essentially pigeonholed into having to use Assimilate, like I said, if you wanted to not get immediately roasted on Steel Path. So now that she can survive with some overguard, some shields, and she has much better utility, some damage bonuses, it's pretty good. I wouldn't mind bringing her to one of the longer survivals that I like doing, for example. Now, with both of those out of the way, let's hop over and look at the actual builds for both, shall we? Alright, so here we are. We're back on Trinity since we showed her gameplay first, so we'll go over her build first as well. Like I said, I am using Roar instead of her first ability. Actually, you know what? Let's go over the Archon shards first, like I usually do. Forgot to do that. So for the Archon shards on Trinity, I'm using, per usual, all Tau Forged, because I'm fancy like that. I'm using 3 Tau Forged Crimsons, and all of them are for ability strength, so this is plus 45% strength. And then we're using some shards that we don't usually use very often. We're using 2 Azure shards, and they're both for armor, so this is adding 450 armor. This armor, which we'll discuss in a moment here in a little bit more detail, is a huge survivability buff to this build, and I mean huge, because Trinity has so much damage reduction stacking going on in this build here. So we'll go ahead and cover that right now, in fact. So usually Trinity only has, right now she has 585, so if you subtract the 450 that we're currently getting from shards, she only has 135 armor usually. So that is, of course, terrible armor that provides barely any damage reduction. So with just the 135 armor, if you copy this exact build, you know, the mods and the arcanes and everything, you copy everything about this build except for just those 2 Archon shards, this build will have around 90,000 EHP. That's because the amount of health you actually have is 1,890 after Arcane and Blessing is stacked up all the way, so ignore the 690 here, it's actually 1,890. And then if you multiply that by the 75% damage reduction from Link and the 75% damage reduction from Blessing, those are multiplicative with each other, so that ends up being a 93.75% reduction. And then Adaptation, so Adaptation says that it stacks up to 90% DR. It's never, at least almost never, actually a 90% DR, because it's 90% per individual damage type. So, and it only adapts to the highest damage type that an enemy does. So even if you adapt all the way up to 90% of one damage type the enemy is dealing 2 or 3, that's not actually 90% DR, because you're not mitigating 90% of all of their damage. But you can reliably say Adaptation gives you at least a 50% overall DR, for example, so that's still doubling your EHP. So when you combine that with a 93.75, that's a little over 97%. So we're going to round down, just to be safe, and say that overall you're getting 97% DR between her 3rd, her 4th, and Adaptation. So if you stack all of that on top of this build without the armor shards, you have 90,000 EHP. Just by adding on that 450 armor from those 2 shards, you go from 90,000 to closer to 184,000 EHP. So you are more than doubling the EHP, the health tanking capability of this build. Now, of course, if you're not interested in health tanking, if you want to go to a way higher level, because I will say, in order for this health tanking to not be good enough, you have to go to very high levels on Steel Path that most people don't play. So if you enjoy not having to shield tank, and if you enjoy the health tanking playstyle, this will work for 99% of you watching this video. However, if you want to, you could swap out Arcane Blessing for Arcane Aegis instead, and drop one of the mods here for Prime Redirection, for example, and then go a shield gating build. So say you feel like you don't need the damage increase from a baiting link. You could drop that for Prime Redirection, drop this for Aegis, and then boom, you have a really good high shields build. Although in reality, you can technically shield gate constantly on Trinity anyway, since her 4th ability restores shields, but just to give you guys some options there. So, going over the build here, we're focusing a lot on strength. We, of course, have Blind Rage, we have Growing Power here, we have Molt Augmented, and we have all those strength shards, so we have a lot of strength stacking going on here. We're at 244 strength, and we're at 304 strength with Molt Augmented stacked up. The interesting thing about being at 304 strength with this stacked up, and this is not kind of Growing Power, so because if you're using a different aura, then this math is important. If you are using Growing Power, then you have an extra 25% to stack on, but assume that this wasn't here. So we have exactly 304 strength with my shards I have on plus Molt Augmented. 304 is exactly the amount of strength that you need to link to 9 targets using link. So right now it says 7 because Augmented isn't up, but it will be 9 with that stacked up because they change it so that link now scales with power strength. So just the base 100% gives you 3. But since it scales with strength, you divide 100 by 3, but then you have to round up. So it's every 34% strength that you add on above 100% is another 1 person linked. And 204, which you take 304 and you subtract the base 100, you're adding 204 strength. 204 divided by 34 is exactly 6. So if I had 1% less strength in this build, you would have 1 less target that you're linked to. Now, the good thing about that is that means you could subtract up to 34% strength and you would still be at 8 targets rather than 9. So you would still, even with losing up to 34% strength, only lose 1 target that you're linked to. So for example, if you had to lose 2 of these shards, because you don't have them, or if you want to run something different, you'll still be at 8 versus 9, and you won't drop down to 7, so that is good. But I like being linked to a lot of guys, because one of my favorite things about the Trinity rework, making link scale with power strength, is that it was a large indirect buff to this abating link augment, which with enough strength gives you a 100% armor strip against enemies that you're linked to. So the more enemies that you're linked to, the more reliable that armor strip is, because it will be more of the enemies around you will have none of their armor. This augment is one of the reasons why I don't really care to run Champion's Blessing. Champion's Blessing for me seems a little annoying to maintain, to actually keep it at its max bonus. And whenever you're fighting armored enemies, at least, abating Link on Steel Path is already the equivalent of a 10x damage increase, because enemies on Steel Path typically almost instantly hit that armor cap of 2700 armor, and 2700 armor is 90% damage reduction. If you remove a 90% damage reduction, that's as if you're doing 10 times the damage to the enemy. So this is already basically a 10x damage increase, and it's very reliable now that it scales the target count with power strength. So aside from that, we just care about having really high duration. Even with the duration buff they gave Blessing, at 254 duration, it still only lasts 38 seconds. That's why I said I wish they also buffed its base duration to 20 seconds like Link, because Link lasts 50 seconds on this build, which is very comfortable. And we do want at least some positive range. You can see I am running Narrow-Minded here because, again, duration is super important on this build. You want to keep up that Link, you want to keep up that Blessing. And you want to keep up Roar, too, if you're using it like I am. So to counteract that, we have both Stretch and Augur Reach on here to put us at least a little bit back in the positive. And thanks to Link also giving you knockdown immunity while you're linked to enemies, you don't have to use Prime Surefoot on this build to be knockdown immune. So I threw on Cunning Drift to, again, just keep us at least a little bit in that positive category. And the Arcanes, like I said, are Arcane Blessing and Molt Augmented to give you that extra 60% strength once you're stacked up all the way. So let's go look at the Nyx build now and go over that. Actually, first the shards here. So on Nyx, you can see She really likes the red Jolly Ranchers. I'm using strength, duration, strength, duration, strength. So we have 3 strength shards here for plus 45% strength, and 2 duration shards for plus 30% duration. Because that just seemed to work out really well, honestly. So the reason why I replaced her third ability, Chaos, with Nourish is because Pacifying Bolts, they made it so that along with making you throw out additional bolts when you toss it out, it also applies a guaranteed radiation status effect. So it kind of fills the role of what Chaos does, because the main useful thing that Chaos does is that you're applying the radiation status, the confusion effect to everybody around you. Pacifying Bolts augment basically makes it so that your Psychic Bolts ability can fill that role instead of Chaos, which kind of opens up a slot here. Now, you could argue that if the defense stealing that Psychic Bolts is giving you is good enough to where it keeps you alive, then you won't have a lot of use case for Absorb unless you want to keep it for the damage bonus it gives you after you end Absorb. Excuse me. Then you could argue keeping that, but so you could maybe replace Absorb with Nourish or whatever ability you want instead, so that's up to you guys. But as for the actual build here, I went primarily relying on shield tanking. So between Prime New Direction, Arcane Aegis, and Adaptation, we have some very beefy shields. The shields will be tanky in and of themselves due to having a lot of shields from Prime New Direction and being able to get over shields from her bolts, as well as the DR being applied to shields from Adaptation. And even if we get low on shields or we run out of shields, we can occasionally rely on Aegis to give us that 12-second, basically, perma-regen, perma-invulnerability. Outside of that, as you can see, we just want a lot of duration and strength, and a little bit of range on here from Stretch. Duration so that we can keep up Nourish, we can keep up the Psychic Bolts buffs, we can keep up Mind Control. This lasts for almost 2 minutes. This is 111 seconds with 185 duration, so you have a super long-lasting companion, so it's really nice. With this build, we have a ton of strength. Since we're sitting at 288 before augmented, that means that we're sitting at closer to like 330, 340%, and then that's also, we have growing power, so like 360+% duration. So lots of, strength, so lots of strength, which means lots of defenses that we can get from Psychic Bolts. Lots of energy multiplied from Nourish, so energy is not going to be an issue. This is a build that I've been playing around with. It's what I use in the gameplay. I like it quite a bit. Again, this is another frame, along with the Trinity build that we just showed, that I feel like, since you can steal Overguard at least some of the time, that anytime you have Overguard, you're immune to knockdown. So depending on how reliably you feel that you'll have Overguard, you could argue that you might not need Prime Sure-Footed on her either. So I went with Preparation, so you can start off the mission with max energy, immediately pop that Nourish, immediately pop your Psychic Bolts on the first enemies you see, and start racking up those defenses. But of course, it is up to you if you want the... If you feel, especially if you're going to go to really high levels and you're going to be mostly shield tanking and you think that you'll lose your Overguard really fast, you could swap this back out for Prime Sure-Footed to make sure that you're not knocked around constantly. So it's up to you guys. Yeah, that's about it. I really like both of these reworks. I think they made both of the frames much better than they used to be, especially Nyx. She was definitely the real glow-up of the two. Let me know down below, what do you guys think? Do you guys like the reworks? Do you think that they were good enough? Is there anything else you would change? Do you enjoy playing these frames? Yeah, good stuff. I like them both, and I will see you guys in the next one.